Hello everyone and welcome back to our youth radio. I'm sure that you couldn't wait to hear from us again. Today we are having our second episode of our podcast and an interview with some very familiar and interesting person that you have already met in our first episode of this podcast. So I suppose that you're already guessing who might be our guest today. It's Professor Steven Friedman. Hello, Mr. Friedman. I hope that you're good and prepared for our questions today, and I'm glad that you made time for us again. So, if you're ready, we may begin with some questions. I have heard many people saying that they are bad or good people, but something that I have wondered is what is the difference between good and bad people and how we determine someone as bad or good person? Is that makes us human?
Hi, and I'd like to thank you for an excellent question. What is a good person? What is a bad person? And how does that relate to the nature of human beings? Well, a good person helps others. A bad person hurts others by what they do or what they fail to do. And so the concept of good and bad people is understood within a social context, what benefits others, what benefits the society. And it's not surprising that there would be that kind of connection, because language, after all, exists not to communicate ideas. Without language, we'd have no ideas, but it exists to coordinate behavior so that we can survive and flourish within a group setting, within a social context. We have social capabilities that enable us to flourish in this world more effectively than we would if we were contending against nature on our own. But there's a Buddhist admonition: die while alive and be completely dead, then do whatever you will. All is good. Well, all is good. There's a lot of bad behavior, evil, if you like, is motivated by senses of insignificance, by senses of what our needs fundamentally are that may not be being fulfilled. So a great deal of bad behavior operates in a context of presumption. What we think we need, what we think is in our self-interest, what we think will serve us in the end. But philosophy deals not with presumption, not with possibility, but with certainty. And so these types of behaviors that are based upon senses of what we need, senses of what we deserve, are really presumptive responses that cannot rigorously ultimately be justified philosophically, and that philosophy can free us from. There are philosophers like Nietzsche famously who write of a world beyond good and evil. Well, good and evil are comparative terms, and within philosophic space, rigorous space, no comparisons are possible. A normal social space, the space of language, of technology, of daily life, is a space that operates within the logic, the function of convergence, things coming together. Comparisons are based upon convergences. We bring things together and see how they compare. A rigorous space, a philosophic space, is a divergent space that doesn't allow comparisons to arise at all. The kind of comparisons that are responsible for so much dissatisfaction, so much unhappiness within like social media contexts, when people are endlessly comparing themselves with others. So philosophic space, rigorous space, by being divergent, by not permitting the kinds of comparisons that normal life is witness to, is able to operate as that truth that sets us free, even from the motivations for so much bad behavior, evil behavior. There's an aphorism I've written, selflessness, how one acts not out of need. Because even our needs, even what we think we require, are actually things that are presumed. We cannot know for sure. We can't even know for sure rigorously that we need oxygen. Not this moment or the next moment, because that hasn't been tested. Now, obviously, that's an extreme sort of position, an extreme point of view, but religions embrace extreme points of view. What a complete solution to the world requires is effectively an extreme response to our circumstances. And so, good and evil operate within a social context, a social arena, but ultimately there is a more powerful philosophic truth that takes us away from the types of claims and presumptions that motivate so much bad behavior. And in that sense, philosophy has the capability of placing us not just in a realm of freedom, but in a realm of absolute safety, where there's nothing to fear and there's nothing to desire, because effectively, philosophically, even scientifically, we are all at the still center of existence. And so effectively cannot justify any feelings or tendencies or claims of insignificance, of anything that would threaten our dignity, undermine our dignity. And so ultimately, philosophically, evil, bad behavior need not be motivated.
Interesting answer, Mr. Friedman. I'm sure that many people would agree with you. Now we move on to another topic that I'm sure bothers many people, and they are curious to hear your answer to it. So, my second question for you today is, are we alone in this universe?
Well, another excellent question. Are we alone in the universe? And it turns out, perhaps not surprisingly, that the question is more deeply philosophical than it is scientific, in the sense that it relates to the nature of concepts, of how we decide that something is a particular thing at all. And we make that decision based upon degrees of similarity, of comparisons. Two things are the same type of thing if they have enough things in common. Now, what they have to have in common, how many things they need to have in common to be considered the same type of object, to be considered a chair, is not something that can be determined in advance. It's something that experience reveals to us. And this is an understanding of the nature of concepts, the nature of language, that runs counter to the dominant understanding that really goes back as far as Plato. The notion that if something is a chair or a table or a person, it's because they have the essence of chairness, the essence of personhood. It's a view that, even though it prevailed for 2,000 years, was ultimately, I think, definitively, successfully challenged by the philosopher Wittgenstein, who argued again, I think convincingly, that it's not on the basis of an essence that we discern that allows us to call two things the same, but based upon, again, what Wittgenstein called family resemblances, the degree of similarity. Well, the question is, how similar does something have to be to us to be considered what? An intelligent being like ourselves? It's not something that we can determine independently of the experience of a candidate for that type of creation, that type of intelligent being. But within the universe as we currently understand it, there are billions upon billions of stars and billions of star systems. And within those star systems, there are planets that we've been discovering in recent years that have some degree of similarity, at least, to the Earth. So the question is, if the processes that operate on the Earth and have operated for the 5 billion years of Earth's existence, as we imagine, as we theorize, if those processes are operating elsewhere, uniformly, as it were, throughout the universe, then we would expect that complex organisms, like the types of living things found on Earth, would arise. Living things are understood to be very complex biological units, assemblages, convergences of lots of complex molecular units. But the key question among all the billions of possible star systems and potentially billions of possible planets that might allow for complex molecular development of the type that characterized the evolution of life on Earth, the real question is, will the result of those processes elsewhere be sufficiently similar so that we will recognize the result as living or as intelligent on the paradigm, on the similar enough to ourselves that we can apply that concept and feel that this is something that is like ourselves sufficiently so, yes, we are not alone in its presence. The chances of that, actually, are not very great, because our understanding of evolution is that it's a random process, and that had it taken different sort of directions randomly 1 billion years ago, 2 billion years ago, we may never have arisen. Or the types of life forms that we see would have been totally different based upon random changes that might have occurred early in the evolutionary development of our planet. So, it's possible, it's probably likely, based upon the real nature of the scientific process, which tends to assume similarity. We assume, for example, that the history of Earth is similar in lots of ways to what we're experiencing around us. That if there are volcanoes, if there are earthquakes, if there are tsunamis today, there were such phenomena 1,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, 500 million years ago. It's the principle of uniformitarianism, that the past operates according to similar laws and principles as the present, that elsewhere in the universe, similar laws and principles are operating. It's not something that is a rigorously established result. It is a heuristic principle. It guides our investigations. It can lead us to new discoveries. It can lead us to new technologies, abilities to manipulate the world in directions that are in our fundamental interest as we recognize them. So, is it likely that we will be able to engage, that we will be able to even communicate with some complex biological result of an evolutionary process on another world? Not likely. And the strongest argument against the existence of such forms that are similar enough to us that we would recognize them as, coexistent types of things is, where are they? In the sense that current scientific understanding is that the Earth has existed for about 5 billion years. The universe for about 15 billion, which means that if the kinds of processes that were responsible for our development are taking place elsewhere, there are other star systems that would have had a head start on us. Can you imagine technologically where we will be in 20 years, in 100 years, in 1,000 years, in 1,000,000 years, given that possibility of our continuing to exist? Other star systems that were in existence 1 billion years before us, 5 billion years before us, 10 billion years before us, one would think, have, if they've given rise to life comparable to ourselves, would have been capable of technological results vastly superior to what we've now achieved. And so as we are exploring the universe for signs of intelligent life elsewhere, you would think that 1 billion years from now, our capability of doing that would be so much greater that we would probably be able to potentially investigate every star system with the technology that 1 billion years of development might produce. So it's actually a principle that was advanced by Fermi, the physicist who was responsible for early developments in the Manhattan Project, actually, that led to the development of the atomic bomb during World War II. Fermi's principle is actually a paradox. The notion that if there is intelligent life, and if it's had a head start on us by thousands or millions or billions of years, we should have gotten some notice of it by now. So the strongest evidence against the possibility of life elsewhere is that we haven't encountered it yet. We haven't seen it yet. The strongest philosophical argument against it is not that complex chemical and biological organisms are impossible, but that the chances of their developing along a line that was sufficiently similar to how we developed, that the result is something that we recognize as living, that we recognize as intelligent, is not strong. So it's actually, we can sort of get some additional context when we think about like other living things on this earth, that there's still question in many people's minds as to whether animals have genuine consciousness, any degree of self-awareness. And the reason that we tend to, when we do, doubt the inner life, the the degree of consciousness of an animal is because we're not communicating with those animals or not very well. To the degree that we communicate with others, we see them as similar fundamentally to ourselves. If we were not able to establish any communication with other human beings, for whatever reason, we would doubt that other human beings had consciousness. We would doubt the existence, in other words, of what philosophically is referred to as other minds. Our sense of other people being fundamentally like ourselves on the inside is because of our ability to communicate with them. And by communicating with them, I mean our ability to influence their behavior. If everyone always ignored us, we would come to the conclusion that maybe they're not human at all. Maybe they're robotic in some way. And they appear human on the outside, but don't have that inner life that characterizes ourselves.
Thank you, Mr. Friedman, for your answers and your time today. I'm sure that at least we clarified today's topics a little for our listeners. We will look forward to seeing you again in our Youth Radio. Dear listeners, I hope you also liked today's topics and questions. See you again in the next episode. Have a good day, your Youth Radio Bitola.